The convent's eastern door was found bricked shut, but those who pressed their ears against the stone swore they still heard voices moving inside. 14 nuns had entered one night in 1,871. None were ever seen again. The convent stood at the farthest edge of the parish, where the road gave up on cobblestone and became little more than a worn track through fields of rye and stone. Its walls were pale and tall, weathered by salt wind, and its windows narrow slits that caught the sun but never seemed to return it. Travelers passing through rarely spoke of it, but those who did always mentioned the door, the one that no longer opened, the one that seemed older than the rest of the convent itself. It was a prayer room once, a small chamber off the eastern cloister, said to be the most sacred space in the building. Yet by the winter of 1,871, it had been bricked shut from the inside. The story passed between townsfolk like a hymn gone sour. They said that on a cold November evening, 14 nuns entered the prayer room at vespers, their heads bowed, their hands clasping candles that burned with unnaturally long flames. The sisters filed in silently, robes brushing stone, and when the last veil vanished across the threshold, the door closed of its own weight. No one had seen them emerge again. For days, lanterns flickered in the narrow windows above the cloister, and faint hymns drifted across the fields at night, layered and strange, as though the women prayed in tongues not meant for ordinary ears. Then, without warning, the light ceased. The singing stopped. The door remained sealed. Masons who later examined the wall swore the bricks were set from within. The mortar was clean, deliberate, as if each sister had taken her turn laying stone over stone, erasing the very passage they had entered. Farmers claimed they heard weeping behind the wall that first winter, not desperate but measured, like voices confessing one by one. Others said they smelled frankincense in the fields for weeks, though no mass had been held. When curious men asked the bishop why the chamber had been left untouched, he offered only a line written on heavy parchment: "They are not lost. They are keeping watch." No further explanation followed. The convent itself carried on in quiet rhythm, bells ringing, crops tended, yet the eastern wing drew fewer steps with each passing season. Children dared each other to press an ear against the wall, to listen for prayers stitched into silence. Some swore they heard heartbeats. Others returned pale, whispering of whispers low and layered. Not words, but the sound of something remembering. The convent never confirmed nor denied what had happened that night. They never spoke of the sisters again. But the sealed door remained, patient and waiting, its stones humming faintly when the wind moved just right, as if 14 voices still lingered on the other side, bound forever in prayer. The convent of St. Aurelia sat where the hills broke into chalk and shale, its foundations older than any ledger cared to record. The walls rose from the ground like bones showing through thin skin, pale and worn smooth by centuries of weather, yet still standing with a stubbornness that unnerved those who passed too close. Beneath it ran a network of catacombs, older even than the convent itself, carved in the age of Roman occupation when soldiers buried their dead beneath the limestone. The corridors twisted for miles under the ridge, narrow vaults lined with stone niches where bones once lay in ordered silence. By the time the convent was built in the 12th century, those bones had long since vanished, but the air beneath still held the taste of dust and iron, as though the dead had never entirely left. The nuns called their home a sanctuary, but the villagers spoke of it as a wound. The convent's bell tower loomed higher than the treetops, visible from every field and river path, a sentinel that seemed to watch rather than welcome. Farmers plowing nearby swore the bells rang without hands, a hollow tolling that sometimes drifted across the valley at midnight, even when the ropes hung slack and no sister stood at the belfry. Horses balked at the path leading up the hill, planting their hooves as if the earth itself warned them not to climb. Shepherds kept their flocks wide of the convent walls, muttering that their lambs sickened when grazing too close to the eastern fence. Those who lived nearest swore the ground around the convent never settled. Fence posts leaned overnight, stones shifted in the fields, and wells grew cloudy without cause. They said the catacombs breathed, that on certain nights when the moon was high, you could feel a current of air rising through the cracks in the chapel floor, carrying with it a smell not of incense or damp earth, but something sweeter and heavier, like rotting fruit left in a locked room. Some claimed the sisters used the catacombs as passageways, appearing suddenly in places no road could have brought them, their sandals unstained by mud after storms. Travelers who lodged at the village inn often remarked on the silence of the hills, a silence broken only by the sudden toll of the convent's bells. The sound came hollow, as if wrung from beneath the ground rather than above it, and always in sequences of 14. No priest ever explained the pattern. The villagers stopped asking. Over time, they learned to turn their faces when the bells began to sound, whispering prayers into their sleeves and pressing their thumbs into the crosses around their necks. For it was said the bells of St. Aurelia did not mark the hours of men, but the hours of something older, something the convent was built not to praise but to contain. They arrived without procession, without song, without even the courtesy of bells to mark their entry. 14 women dressed in habits darker than the convent stone appeared one autumn morning in 1869, their faces shadowed by veils that never seemed to lift in the wind. No wagon carried their belongings, no horse bore their weight. They came walking single file along the ridge road, each carrying only a candle, unlit, wrapped in twine. The villagers watched from the fields as the women crossed into the convent gates without pause, and by nightfall word spread that the convent of St. Aurelia had been given new life. Yet life was not the word most used. What had settled there felt more like occupation. The sisters were unlike the nuns who had lived in the valley before. They never spoke their names, never lifted their hoods in the square, and never left the convent in anything but pairs. 2 at a time they moved, silent and swift, their footsteps soft on stone. Parishioners whispered that they were bound to each other in ways the church would not write down. They ate little, drank less, and seemed to spend every hour in prayer. The chapel windows glowed deep into the night, and villagers who passed too close swore they heard chanting still at dawn. The voices never faltered, never thinned, as if the sisters had found a way to outlast their own bodies in devotion. Rumors grew that their vow was not of silence, poverty, or chastity, but of something older. The gravedigger's wife claimed she saw them kneeling in the fields after harvest, hands pressed into the soil as though listening for breath beneath the furrows. A farmer said he found them at the edge of his barn at dusk, humming low, faces turned toward the rafters where swallows nested. When he spoke to them, they did not reply. They only stood until the birds fled and then left as quietly as they had come. Inside the chapel, the parish priest found little comfort in their presence. He admitted once, under drink, that their prayers seemed to bend time itself. Hours passed differently when the sisters prayed. Sometimes vespers stretched until the candles burned down to wax pools, yet when he checked his pocket watch, only a minute had passed. Other times a short hymn seemed to consume entire afternoons. "They do not pray to God as we know him," he muttered. "They are keeping vigil for something else." By the second winter, the villagers had stopped asking questions. They left food at the convent gate, loaves of bread, jars of honey, salted fish, though none ever saw the sisters collect them. When snow fell, no tracks marked the path to the chapel, yet the bells still rang, and the chanting still carried on the wind. It was said no human body could endure such endless devotion, and so the whispers grew bolder. The sisters of St. Aurelia were not praying to be heard, they were praying to hold something back. At first, the whispers were dismissed as tricks of stone and echo, the way sound carried oddly in old chapels where the walls had absorbed centuries of psalms. Yet soon, even the most practical villagers admitted something was not right in St. Aurelia's chapel. The sisters gathered there each evening as the sun fell, but their chanting did not resemble Latin hymns or the familiar cadences of Scripture. The words bent strangely on the tongue, sharp at one moment, drawn out to near silence the next, as though stitched together from languages no one had ever heard. Those who lingered near the chapel door swore they could feel the words in their bones, vibrating softly, loosening joints as if trying to separate body from spirit. The parish priest, already uneasy with the arrival of the 14, tried more than once to join their prayers, but each attempt ended the same. He would kneel, close his eyes, and wake later with no memory of having left, always outside the chapel gates, his knees raw, as if pressed into gravel for hours. He never spoke publicly of these lapses, though one evening he confessed to the gravedigger that time inside the chapel did not pass as it should. "I saw dusk fall and rise again," he whispered, pale as a sheet. "I prayed through a single candle's flame, yet outside, the snow had melted." Villagers began to notice the same distortion. Those who entered at vespers came out disoriented, unsure if minutes or days had passed. A girl who carried water for the sisters claimed she saw her own reflection age in the chapel glass, her braid turning silver before returning dark when she stepped outside. Another insisted that her shadow stretched across the nave in 14 directions at once, each outline moving slightly slower than her own body. Farmers said the sun seemed to linger above the convent roof longer than it should, as though dusk waited for permission to fall until the sisters were done with their chanting. Even when the chapel sat empty, the sounds remained. Travelers passing along the ridge road often stopped and turned their heads, thinking they heard a murmur just behind them, only to find no one there. At night, those who lived closest swore the chapel whispered through the walls, layered voices humming low, not loud enough to decipher, yet impossible to ignore. Some likened it to the sound of bees inside a hive. Others said it was closer to the tide pressing against stone, a rhythm too vast to belong to human throats. By the second year of the sisters' residence, no villager would enter the chapel alone. Even weddings and funerals were hurried, prayers mumbled, candles extinguished before their time. For though no one could explain it, all agreed on one thing. Once you heard the whispers of Saint Blanc, Aurelia, you could never be certain how long you had truly been listening, or whether the prayers you heard were for God at all. The ledger was discovered years later, though some swore it had always been there, waiting in the convent archives beneath layers of dust and disuse. It was bound in cracked leather, the color of dried blood, its clasp a strip of tarnished brass that seemed too heavy for such a small book. Unlike the orderly registers of births, deaths, and sacraments kept by the parish, this ledger was intimate, written in the cramped script of many hands. The ink had faded to a rusty brown, yet the words carried a sharpness that time had not managed to soften. On the first page was a list of names, 14 in total. Not family names, not the surnames one might expect from women who had come from villages and cities scattered across the countryside. Only given names were recorded, as if the sisters had shed all other ties the moment they entered the convent: Miriam, Colette, Sabine, Agnes, Therese, Clara, and so on, until all 14 were accounted for. Each name was followed by a single word, written with a deliberation that suggested more than description, perhaps assignment. Silence, binding, light, measure. The words read less like virtues and more like roles, pieces of a pattern too deliberate to ignore. The following pages offered no prayers, no scripture, only brief notations beside the names, sometimes no more than a date, other times a phrase cut short. Beside Clara's name appeared the word vigil, written twice and then crossed out. Next to Sabine, fever taken. Miriam's line bore only a single mark, a circle inked so heavily that the paper buckled around it. Parish clerks who later handled the book noted that the handwriting shifted often, as though passed from sister to sister, yet the tone of the entries remained disturbingly uniform. There was no warmth, no mention of charity or grace, only record-keeping stripped bare of devotion. One entry read simply, "We are to keep count." Another, "The 12th has wavered." The hours must be bound again. The further the pages turned, the more jagged the handwriting became, until lines ended in sudden scratches, as if the pen had been pulled away mid-stroke. Then, without warning, the entries ceased. The last written word was "measure," scrawled across the margin with such force it cut the page nearly in half. Blank paper followed, untouched, though the edges appeared smudged, as if someone had pressed their fingers hard against them, leaving no ink, only the impression of weight. The ledger was closed after that, clasp fastened tight. The archivist who catalogued it refused to keep it among the parish records, insisting it hummed faintly when left alone on the desk, as though the words themselves remembered being spoken. Villagers who heard of the ledger whispered that it was not a record at all, but a map of the vow the sisters had taken, each single word marking a thread in a tapestry of prayer too dangerous to name outright. And when asked why the writing had stopped so suddenly, the archivist offered only one explanation, delivered in a trembling voice. Because whatever they were binding, it no longer needed ink. It was already awake. The morning of the lock-in passed like any other. Smoke from the convent's kitchen chimney rose straight and thin into the autumn sky, and the bells rang their measured tones over the valley. Nothing seemed unusual until late afternoon, when the 14 sisters were seen leaving their quarters in single file, each carrying an unlit candle bound in twine and a length of rope looped across their shoulders. They did not speak as they crossed the cloister, but their lips moved in rhythm, a low humming that rolled like distant thunder through the courtyard stones. Farmers returning from the fields paused to watch, uneasy, as the procession filed toward the eastern chapel door. The sisters' movements were deliberate, every step equal in length, every head bowed at the same angle, as though rehearsed countless times before. Those who stood near enough to listen swore the humming carried a second sound beneath it, a faint echo that did not come from their throats at all but from the walls themselves. One boy later told his mother that he saw the shadows of the nuns stretch far longer than their bodies, reaching across the chapel floor as if something inside the room was already pulling them in. As the sun sank lower, the candles were lit one by one. Witnesses swore the flames burned without flicker, tall and steady despite the wind curling through the cloister. The sisters held them high, faces hidden behind veils, and stepped into the prayer room 2 at a time. With each pair that entered, the humming grew louder, until the final 2 silent eyes lowered, passed through the door, and the sound stopped entirely. What happened next was never forgotten. The door, heavy oak reinforced with iron, closed with such force that the very stones of the chapel shook. No hand had touched it. The sound reverberated across the valley, startling flocks of birds into the air and sending horses bucking against their tethers. When the villagers ran to the chapel, they found the door sealed from within. Not simply locked, but bricked, as if the stone itself had rearranged to close off the entrance. For hours, people pressed their ears to the wall, listening. At first there was silence, then faint voices rising in unison, a chant without pause or breath. It carried into the night, long after the candles had burned out, long after the sun had set and risen again. By dawn, the villagers could no longer tell if the sound came from behind the door or from within their own chests. One man swore his heartbeat began to match its rhythm. Another claimed the words, though foreign, lingered on his tongue when he tried to sleep. From that day forward, no one saw the sisters again. The door never opened. And yet, each evening as the sky dimmed, the villagers swore they heard the humming return, soft at first, then louder, as though the 14 voices had never stopped and never intended to. The first cry was heard 3 nights after the doors sealed. It came just after midnight, a low and drawn-out wail that rolled across the chapel yard and into the valley like wind pressed through a hollow reed. Those who lived nearest the convent swore they woke at the same moment, hearts racing, certain it had been the voice of a woman in pain. Yet when they gathered outside the chapel, lanterns in hand, the sound had already faded into silence, leaving only the faint smell of wax and smoke lingering in the air. They pressed their ears to the cold stone and heard nothing but their own blood rushing in their heads. By dawn they convinced themselves it had been imagination, but the following night the cry returned, shorter this time, and joined by others, muffled and layered, as if 14 throats were straining from beneath the weight of stone. For weeks the cries came in irregular bursts, sometimes a single sob, sometimes a chorus of wails rising all at once, cut off abruptly as though a hand had clamped down over every mouth. Farmers began to keep their families indoors after sunset, whispering prayers as the hours passed. A few claimed they saw candlelight leaking through hairline cracks in the chapel walls, thin slivers of flame that bent and wavered as though blown by breath from within. One shepherd swore he saw shadows move across the window panes, tall and wavering, even though the glass had long since been painted over. Food was left at the convent gate for a time bread, jars of broth, baskets of fruit, but no hand ever reached to collect them. The loaves remained untouched, molding in the sun, while the milk curdled in its pitchers. After the third week, the offerings ceased. Villagers muttered that the sisters no longer needed earthly sustenance, that whatever vow had drawn them into the prayer room had replaced hunger with something else. Still, the wailing continued. Children woke screaming, insisting they heard voices calling their names, though their parents swore the cries were muffled and nameless. Then came the sudden silences. Entire nights passed without a sound, so complete that even the crickets in the fields fell quiet. People began to fear the silence more than the cries, for it carried the weight of something finished, as though the sisters' work had reached a stage beyond human suffering. When the wails returned, they seemed weaker, fainter, not in tone but in distance, as if the voices were receding deeper into the stone itself. By the end of winter, the cries had dwindled to whispers. Villagers swore they still heard them if they listened hard enough, a faint hum beneath the chapel floor, not sorrow, not pleading, but something closer to lullabies sung from behind walls that should never have echoed with life. And though no one admitted it aloud, all wondered the same thing if the cries had not stopped, but simply moved further inward, into a place where no door could ever open. When the first winter passed and the voices from behind the chapel wall had neither ceased nor yielded, the parish council sent word to the diocese. A messenger was dispatched on horseback, carrying a sealed letter that detailed the unease of the villagers, the sleepless nights, the strange lights glimpsed through the stone, and the unsettling cries that still rose and fell without pattern. Weeks later, the bishop's reply arrived, written in a firm, almost impatient hand. It contained only a single line. They are not lost, they are keeping watch. No further instructions were given, no blessing, no guidance. The letter was read aloud to the council, and a silence heavier than snow fell across the room. The priest who had once served the convent trembled as the words echoed in his mind. He had expected command, perhaps even the order to break the wall and retrieve the sisters, but instead he was told to leave the room sealed. It was as if the diocese not only knew of the vow but sanctioned it, as though the lock-in was part of some larger unspoken ritual. When pressed for explanation, the priest could only repeat the bishop's words, his voice cracking each time. The villagers did not accept it so easily. Mothers begged for the sisters to be freed, arguing that no vow could require such torment. Fathers, worn thin from nights of restless listening, gathered at the chapel doors with mallets and chisels, intent on breaking through. But when they struck the first blow, the tools bent, iron twisting as though the stone itself rejected intrusion. One man fell to his knees with his hands blistered, insisting he had felt heat radiating from the wall, not the warmth of fire but the scald of flesh pressed too close. After that, no one attempted again. Rumors spread quickly that the bishop himself had visited the convent years before the lock-in, that he had walked the catacombs beneath St. Aurelia and emerged pale, lips blue, eyes wide, muttering prayers no one recognized. Some claimed he had known all along that the sisters were not meant to serve the parish but to guard it. Guard it from what? No one dared to ask aloud. The villagers grew bitter with the church's silence, yet none could deny that the bishop's refusal carried a strange authority. They are keeping watch, the people whispered to one another, though none could decide whether that meant protection or imprisonment. By the time spring thawed the valley, families had begun to lock their doors at dusk, not to keep danger out, but to hold something in. And still the wall stood sealed, the bishop's words lingering over the town like a benediction that felt more like a curse. The omens began quietly, small details that might have been dismissed as coincidence if not for their persistence. The first child baptized at the convent after the lock-in was an infant named Elias, born to a mason's wife. The ceremony took place in the chapel just before dusk, when the light through the narrow windows bled amber across the stone. The priest poured holy water over the child's brow, his hand steady though his voice faltered on the blessing. Elias did not wail as most newborns did. He only blinked once and stared at the ceiling as though following something unseen. That night, his parents woke to find his crib sheets stained with streaks of red. The boy had cried, but not tears. Blood seeped from his eyes in thin lines, dark against his pale skin. For 3 nights it continued, each evening beginning at the same hour, each morning ending with his face calm and dry. Word spread swiftly through the parish. Other children baptized in those weeks suffered the same affliction. Mothers clutched their infants through sleepless nights, listening to their cries echo against the walls until dawn. Some swore the blood smelled not of iron but of incense, sharp and sweet, as though the tears carried with them the memory of the chapel air. A few fathers urged the priest to abandon baptisms entirely, but he shook his head, muttering that sacraments must not yield to fear. Still, he trembled when he raised the font lid, and villagers noticed he no longer dipped his fingers into the water without first crossing himself 3 times. The most chilling account came from a woman named Mariette. She claimed to wake in the middle of the night to the sound of her infant's blanket crackling. When she lit her candle, she found the fabric scorched in the shape of a handprint, the fingers long and unnaturally thin, as if pressed down by heat rather than flame. The child lay unharmed beneath it, sleeping soundly, but the mark never faded. Even when she replaced the blanket, she said the handprint reappeared by morning, burned anew into the cloth. When she whispered this to the other mothers at market, none dared call her a liar. Instead, they lowered their eyes and asked if the hand had pointed toward the convent. Mariette admitted it had. By the season's end, no parent wished their child to be baptized within St. Aurelia's walls, though few admitted it openly. Some walked 2 villages over for the sacrament, carrying their infants swaddled in salt and garlic. Others simply kept their babies unblessed, whispering that a soul left unmarked might be safer than one touched by the convent's font. Yet each time the parish bells tolled, the mothers tightened their grip on their children, certain the sound carried not prayer but a warning, a reminder that what had begun behind the sealed door was reaching outward, one omen at a time. It was the travelers who first spoke openly of the sound, men and women passing through the valley on their way to market towns farther east. They claimed that as dusk fell and the fields drew long with shadow, the air grew thick with a hum unlike any they had known. It rose slowly at first, a low vibration like the beginning of thunder, before shaping itself into words carried on the wind. 14 voices, clear and steady, wove together as though born of a single throat, each pitch rising and falling in perfect unison. The chant never faltered, never cracked, and never paused for breath. To those who listened, it seemed endless, a prayer that looped upon itself, without beginning and without end. Yet when the travelers sought its source, they found the convent still and silent. No candlelight glowed from the chapel windows, no footsteps echoed in the cloister. The prayer, though undeniable to their ears, left no trace within the stone walls. One merchant swore he heard the voices so close he could feel them brush against his skin, but when he pressed his ear to the chapel door, there was nothing, only the faint coolness of the stone and the hollow sound of his own heart beating. He left before morning, muttering that he could still hear the chant hours later, long after he had left the valley behind. The villagers, who had grown used to strangeness, whispered that the sisters no longer prayed within the convent, but upon the air itself. Some said the chant had escaped the prayer room and now wandered freely across the fields, tying the valley in knots of sound. Farmers reaping grain reported losing hours, claiming that the sun froze in the sky while the chant circled them, pinning them in place until suddenly the light shifted and night had come. A shepherd returning home late insisted he had crossed the same stretch of pasture 3 times, guided by the sound of 14 voices that led him in circles until his flock collapsed from exhaustion. Even those who tried to shut it out could not escape it. One widow plugged her ears with wax, but when she did, she swore the chant began inside her chest, humming along her ribs like strings drawn taut. Another claimed that if one listened too closely, the words began to arrange themselves, syllables sliding into meaning. But no two who listened agreed on what was spoken. Some swore it was scripture, others insisted it was nothing human at all. The prayer stretched across weeks, months, unbroken, as though the sisters had stepped outside the reach of time itself. To hear it was to know that whatever vow had bound them inside the prayer room was still unfolding, not contained by walls or stone, but carried in the very breath of the valley. And each night, as the chant wound on without end, the people of Dogwood Parish felt less certain that the voices belonged to women at all. The bell tower of St. Aurelia had long stood as the highest point in the valley, its iron mouth heavy with rust, its rope once frayed and patched so many times that it seemed to carry the weight of centuries. After the sisters locked themselves in the prayer room, the rope was cut clean and removed altogether, coiled and buried in the rectory garden as though distance from the bell might silence what no one wished to hear again. For months, the tower remained mute, its shadow falling across the fields like a sundial that no longer kept time. Then, one winter night just past midnight, the silence of the convent broke. Those who lived nearest swore they woke in unison at the first toll. The sound was heavier than thunder, a vibration that rattled shutters and sent dust drifting from rafters. Dogs howled in their pens. Chickens flapped wildly in their coops as if dawn had come too soon. The villagers rushed into the square, lanterns swaying, eyes fixed on the tower. No rope hung from the belfry, yet the bell continued to swing, its great iron body heaving back and forth in the dark, as though pulled by an unseen hand. It rang once, then again, and again 14 times in perfect measure. Between each toll was a pause so deep it felt like the valley itself had stopped breathing. Men counted under their breath, hoping the sound would end before the number grew too high, but it did not falter until the 14th strike rolled out across the fields and dissolved into the hills. When the echo faded, the tower stood still once more, the bell motionless, as if it had never moved. At dawn, a few brave souls climbed the belfry to see what could explain the night's terror. They found the beam intact, the wheel unbroken, the iron tongue hanging quiet. No footprints marked the snow on the steps, no sign of a hand to have forced it. Yet the stone beneath the bell was warm to the touch, as though it had been kissed by fire rather than frost. One man swore he felt his fingertips pulse when he brushed the iron, as though the bell carried a heartbeat of its own. From then on, the number 14 clung to every whisper of the sisters. 14 voices in the wind, 14 shadows in the chapel glass, 14 tolls of a bell with no rope. The villagers would not say it aloud, but in their hearts they feared the count was no coincidence. It was an announcement. A mark left in iron to remind them that the sisters still kept vigil, and that whatever they prayed for, it had not yet ended. He came in the spring, when the thaw left the valley damp and swollen, the roads slick with mud that clung to boots like lead. No one knew his name, only that he called himself a priest and carried a leather satchel with a worn missal inside. His cassock was travel-stained, the hem frayed from miles of walking, but his bearing was steady, and his eyes burned with a conviction that unsettled the villagers more than comforted them. He arrived at dusk, asking no lodging, no bread, only directions to the convent. When told of the sealed prayer room, of the cries behind stone and the bishop's refusal, he crossed himself once and whispered, "Then it is my duty." That night, he walked alone into the convent courtyard. Witnesses later claimed they saw his lantern flicker once as he reached the eastern wall, but when the light steadied, his shadow did not. The villagers gathered at a distance, unwilling to follow, and watched as he laid his palm flat against the stone. The air seemed to bend around him, the mist curling low as if listening. Some swore they heard him mutter scripture, though the words twisted strangely in their ears, sounding neither like Latin nor any tongue they recognized. He pressed harder, whispering louder, until his voice rose into something closer to a chant, defiant and urgent, a challenge to whatever lingered inside. Then, without warning, the chanting ceased. The courtyard fell still, every lantern guttering at once. A silence followed so deep it made the blood pound in the villagers' ears. When the bravest among them finally crept closer, they found the priest's cassock folded neatly before the sealed door, laid as if by careful hands. His satchel rested atop it, the missal open to a psalm about deliverance, though the words on the page had blurred into smears of ink. Of the priest himself, there was no trace. No footprints led away, no struggle marked the ground. It was as if he had stepped out of his garments and into the wall. The cassock was left where it lay for 3 days. Each morning, the folds appeared freshly pressed, free of dust or damp, as though tended in the night. On the 4th morning, it was gone. The satchel remained, but empty, its lining wet with something sticky that smelled faintly of frankincense and salt. From that night forward, the villagers swore the chapel walls seemed darker, the mortar blackened as if it had absorbed something more than stone. And though no one admitted it aloud, all shared the same unspoken fear that the priest had not failed in his attempt to enter, but had been permitted. And whatever prayers were now being said within those walls no longer came only from 14 voices. The convent's archives were a place few entered willingly, a vaulted chamber beneath the northern wing, where the air smelled of parchment and damp lime, where shelves sagged under the weight of centuries of forgotten records. It was there, among brittle scrolls and worm-eaten ledgers, that the strange candles were found. They sat in a wooden crate pushed against the far wall, their wax long since melted into misshapen lumps. At first they seemed no different from the remnants of countless vigils, but when the archivist held them to the light, patterns emerged, small circles pressed into the surface, arranged in spirals of 14. Each spiral was precise, evenly spaced, as if stamped by some unseen hand. The archivist, an elderly man who had catalogued births, deaths, and tithes for 40 years, swore the marks were not made by wick or flame. They appeared deliberate, almost mathematical, the kind of imprint left by repetition rather than accident. He carried them to his desk, laying each lump out in sequence, only to realize the spirals aligned. When arranged in a line, the circles stretched into a continuous pattern, a chain that coiled inward like a snake devouring itself. He confessed later that staring too long at the design made him dizzy, as though the wax itself were still shifting, trying to pull the eye deeper into its spiral. Word of the candles spread, and soon scholars from the diocese arrived to examine them. Some declared the patterns a form of notation, a code left by the sisters in place of written record. Others argued they were remnants of a forgotten rite, a way of fixing prayer into material form so it could never dissipate. Yet no one could decipher them. The circles bore no letters, no symbols of the church, only the relentless rhythm of 14. 14 loops, 14 spirals, repeated again and again, until the wax seemed to hum with the echo of voices long gone. One historian, a young man from the university, insisted the spirals matched ancient diagrams once carved into Roman catacombs, symbols meant to ward off spirits that lingered between life and death. But when he attempted to publish his findings, his notes vanished from the archive shelves overnight. In their place lay a single stub of wax, freshly melted, still warm to the touch. The spiral on its surface was sharper than the others, as if newly pressed, and when held to the ear, some swore they heard a faint whisper, too soft to decipher but steady, like the end of a prayer that had never ceased. From then on, The candles were locked away in iron boxes. Yet even sealed, they left their presence behind. The archivist said he often found the scent of smoke in the chamber, though no flame had been lit, and his ink dried faster than it should, curling the pages as if time itself bent differently near the wax. Visitors began to avoid the archive altogether, claiming they felt watched among the shelves, the air too heavy, the silence too exact. And so the melted candles remained hidden, their spirals unexplained, their pattern unbroken, as though the sisters had found a way to keep their voices alive, not in flesh, not in stone, but in wax that remembered. The fasting season began without warning. One autumn morning, the farmers of the valley awoke to find their fields spoiled, the once green rows of barley and rye mottled with gray as if touched by rot overnight. Potatoes lifted from the soil crumbled to ash in the hand, their skins splitting with a hollow sigh. Apples blackened on their branches before they could be plucked, collapsing into pulp that stank of vinegar and smoke. No blight or pest explained it, for the livestock too began to fail. Cows gave milk as thin as water, chickens laid eggs that rattled when shaken, hollow shells filled with dust instead of yolk. Within weeks, the larders of Dogwood Parish grew bare. It was not merely famine, but distortion, for what food did remain behaved, as though it carried the curse of the convent. Bread placed in ovens turned black before it browned, loaves rising once, then sagging flat into slabs that smoked without fire. Fish caught from the river dissolved to mush within hours, leaving behind only bones that seemed too many for the bodies they had carried. Families grew gaunt, lips cracked from thirst, though the wells still flowed. And always, through the hunger, the sound of chanting carried faintly on the wind from the convent walls, steady and relentless, as though the sisters themselves were devouring what the people had lost. The whispers spread quickly. Some said the nuns had not only taken food with them into the prayer room, but hunger itself. That their vow was not one of fasting but of possession, that every pang felt in the valley had been gathered and consumed within those sealed walls. Mothers clutched their children tighter at night, whispering that to eat too well was to tempt the sisters' attention, that the carriers of the watch, as some now called them, were listening for the sound of chewing, for the crack of bread crusts and the breaking of bones. One farmer swore he saw a sister in the orchard at dusk, her veil trailing along the earth. She bent to a rotten pear, lifted it in her hands, and as he watched, the fruit reshaped itself, its flesh growing firm, its color returning bright and golden. But when she turned, the pear dissolved into her palm like water, and her mouth never opened to eat. He never spoke of it again, save to leave his farm and vanish into the hills before winter came. By the time snow fell, no one trusted the food that remained. Families boiled leather scraps for broth, chewed bark to silence the gnawing in their bellies. And still they swore the sisters had not grown thin, not even once. No smoke rose from the convent chimney, no bread baked in their ovens, yet they walked the cloister as they always had, pairs of black-robed figures with steady steps, faces hidden, humming beneath their veils. The hunger of the parish deepened, but the fasting of the sisters never broke, as though they had bound the emptiness of an entire valley and swallowed it whole. The only account of what happened in those weeks comes from a monk whose name has long since faded from the records, though his testimony survives in a brittle letter tucked between pages of a psalter. He had been stationed at a nearby abbey, sent to the convent of St. Aurelia by order of his prior, who insisted someone must witness what had taken root there. He arrived at dusk and stayed only a single night, but what he wrote in that letter was enough to chill generations that followed. He described the convent as hollow, though alive with sound. Not the voices of prayer as he expected, but a vibration that seemed to rise from the very walls. "They are sowing their prayers into the walls," the monk wrote in a hand that trembled so violently the ink splattered across the page. "The mortar itself hums." He claimed the stone breathed faintly, exhaling in rhythm with the sisters' chant, and that the seams between the bricks glowed faintly, like threads pulled taut through cloth. He pressed his ear to one corner of the chapel and swore he heard syllables moving within, not carried by air but crawling through the stone like worms through soil. The monk was not invited to preach, but he insisted on delivering a sermon at dawn. The villagers gathered uneasily in the square, desperate for some anchor of faith, yet what he spoke brought no comfort. His voice cracked, his words strayed from Scripture, circling instead around warning. He told them not to touch the chapel walls, not to sleep too close to the sound, not to let the sisters' hymns find a place in their own breath. "They are binding something that does not belong to time," he whispered, "and each note they sing knots the valley tighter." The crowd dispersed uneasy, muttering that his sermon was no sermon at all but confession. That night, he tried to flee, leaving behind his habit and carrying only a rosary carved from bone. He was found at dawn, slumped at the foot of the convent gate, lips pressed against the iron as though listening for something. His pulse still beat faintly, but he never spoke again, his tongue curled useless in his mouth as if sewn shut from within. The letter he left behind was passed from hand to hand in whispers, never read aloud, for fear the words themselves carried the hum he described. To this day, the final line is still quoted by those who dare to recall it. "If you hear the walls, do not answer." They are not praying for God. They are praying for the stone to remember. By the first breath of winter, the convent no longer looked entirely still. The eastern wall of the prayer room, once flat and gray, had begun to swell, a subtle bulge that pressed outward as though something inside were straining against its confines. At first it was dismissed as the ordinary shifting of stone, the slow settling of mortar under the weight of centuries. But then the villagers noticed the movement was not gradual. It pulsed. At dusk, when the sky burned low and the air tightened with frost, the wall seemed to throb in quiet rhythm, swelling and retreating like a chest drawing breath. Children were the first to dare touching it. They crept close under cover of night, hands small and trembling, and laid their palms flat against the cold surface. Each one returned pale and speechless, whispering of a sound that was not sound at all but sensation heartbeats deep within the stone, heavy and slow, echoing like drums from under earth. Their parents dismissed it as childish fancy until the braver men of the parish tried themselves. They, too, staggered back from the wall, hands shaking, their eyes glazed as though they had pressed against a body rather than stone. One swore he felt the beat sink with his own, until his chest hurt and his pulse stuttered. Another claimed he heard not just a heartbeat, but whispers riding on the rhythm, a chant buried beneath each thud, muffled and countless, as if many voices had been layered into the rock. By midwinter, the swelling had grown so pronounced that cracks ran along the outer plaster, splitting in curved lines like stretch marks across skin. Snow caught in the seams and melted, even in the sharpest cold. Those who passed too near swore the wall radiated heat, not a comforting warmth, but the feverish heat of something alive. One night, a shepherd leaned his head against the bulge and collapsed moments later, foaming at the mouth. When he awoke, he could not remember his name, only humming the same 4 notes again and again until his family carried him away. The priest declared it heresy to touch the wall after that, but it did little to stop the rumors. The people of Dogwood Parish began to believe the sisters were no longer inside as women at all, but as something stitched into the mortar itself, their bodies dissolved, their hearts absorbed into stone. The convent stood silent in daylight, but at night the walls shifted and breathed, and the villagers learned to keep their distance, crossing themselves whenever the wind carried the faint rhythm of a heartbeat too large, too patient, and too close to their own. It appeared one morning without warning, folded neatly at the base of the sealed prayer room door. A single veil, pale as bone, lay draped across the stone as though set there with deliberate care. The villagers who discovered it stood at a distance, reluctant to touch it, for it looked too clean, too untouched, as though the fabric had never known dust or earth. Yet the air around it was damp, carrying the sharp tang of salt, And when one man finally stooped to lift it with the tip of his walking stick, the cloth clung wetly, dripping as if it had been pulled from the sea. The convent was miles from the ocean. No river ran near enough to account for its condition. Still, the veil was soaked through, heavy with brine, the droplets sliding down the chapel steps and leaving pale streaks that stung the eyes of anyone who looked too long. Some whispered that the sisters had cried it into being, their tears seeping through stone, weaving the fabric anew in the silence of their vigil. Others muttered darker things, that the veil was not woven at all but grown, a membrane shed from whatever the prayer room now held. When at last it was lifted and carried into the light, the villagers gasped. The cloth cast no shadow. Held high against the sun, it shimmered faintly, but where its outline should have fallen across the ground, there was only empty earth. A boy who reached to touch it screamed when his fingers passed through as if through smoke, and when pulled back, his skin smelled of iron and his nails bore faint crescent marks, as though something had gripped him from the other side. The priest demanded the veil be burned. The villagers gathered kindling and set it aflame, but the fire only licked harmlessly at the edges, leaving the fabric unmarked. They tried to bury it beneath stones, but by dawn it lay once more outside the sealed door, folded neatly, damp again with salt water, as though it had never been moved. It returned this way for 7 nights, no matter where it was taken, no matter how it was hidden. Always wet, always shadowless, always waiting at the threshold. By the 8th morning, the veil was gone. In its place on the chapel step was a small pool of water, clear but thick, within which floated a single strand of hair twisted into a knot. The ground beneath it remained damp for weeks, even after the sun dried the rest of the stones. To the villagers it was no longer a garment but a message, a sign that the boundary between what was inside and what waited outside was thinning. And though no one said it aloud, all feared the same thing, that the veil was never meant for the sisters at all, but for those who lingered too close, a shroud waiting to be claimed. Spring arrived late that year, the thaw reluctant, the snow clinging to the fields as though unwilling to release its hold. When the ice finally broke and the rivers stirred again, the valley braced itself for the familiar sound of the convent's voices. For 3 years the chant had been unbroken, a current running beneath every season, so constant that even those who feared it had grown accustomed to its presence. Yet on the first night of April, the air was still. No hum rose from the chapel walls, no layered voices drifted across the fields. The silence was so complete that even the crows seemed hesitant to call, as though the very sky waited for something that never came. At first, the villagers dared hope. Perhaps the sisters had ended their vigil, perhaps the seal had broken and the prayers were no longer needed. Families crept to the chapel door in cautious relief, pressing their ears against the stone. They heard nothing, no breath, no heartbeat, only the faint rasp of wind across the cracks. The air around the convent felt heavier, as though filled with a weight that did not belong to sound but to its absence. One man compared it to standing in a church after all the candles had been extinguished, when the smoke of devotion lingers, though the flame has died. Days passed, and the silence deepened. Where once the chant had bent time, stretching or condensing the hours, now the stillness held everything in suspension. The bells did not ring, though no one had cut the ropes anew. The chapel windows stayed dark even at dusk. Mothers whispered that their children no longer dreamed, that when they shook them awake in the mornings, their eyes opened too quickly, as though they had never slept at all. Livestock stood motionless in the fields, chewing slowly, their ears cocked toward the convent. Some began to say that the silence itself was the prayer, the culmination of years of binding, a vow so complete it had swallowed its own sound. Others argued that it was not fulfillment but failure, that the sisters' voices had been consumed by what they had tried to hold back. The priest refused to speak on it, though those close to him swore they heard him muttering in his sleep, his lips moving without sound, as if his own breath had been stolen by the quiet. By midsummer, the valley no longer measured time by seasons, but by the hush that pressed against its borders. Night and day blurred together, marked only by the absence of voices that once would not end. And though no one admitted it aloud, many began to fear that the silence was not the end of the sisters' work at all, but the moment it had truly begun. It was not until decades had passed that anyone dared to open the prayer room. By then, most who had lived through the years of chanting and silence were gone, carried by age or by the quiet departures that had thinned the valley to almost nothing. The convent itself had fallen into disrepair, its stones flaking, its roof sagging under the weight of seasons left untended. The diocese, pressed by curious scholars and a handful of persistent clerks, finally sanctioned the unsealing. A group of masons arrived one gray autumn morning, their tools sharp and their hands unsteady, watched by a small crowd of villagers who lingered at the edge of the yard, unwilling to stand too near. The first strike of the chisel rang strangely hollow, as though the wall were not stone but something softer, resisting reluctantly. The mortar cracked in uneven seams, and with each blow, a faint smell of salt drifted outward, sharp and metallic, filling the lungs until the men spat on the ground to clear their throats. Hours passed before the final brick came loose. When the doorway gaped open, no one stepped forward at once. The air that poured from within was stale, yet carried an odd freshness, like wind drawn from beneath the sea. Inside, the chamber was bare. No bodies, no bones, no trace of the 14 women who had entered so many years before. What remained was stranger still. 14 wooden kneelers stood in a circle, arranged with such precision that none faced another directly. Each one was worn smooth, the wood polished to a sheen by the endless weight of knees pressed into prayer. The floor around them bore faint grooves, not scratches but impressions, as though the very stone had softened beneath the years of devotion. At the circle's heart rested a chalice. Its silver was tarnished black, the rim crusted with pale grains that glistened in the dim light. The masons recoiled when they saw what filled it: not wine, not water, but salt, packed tight as though it had grown there rather than been poured. Some said the crystals pulsed faintly. Others swore they smelled tears, though no moisture stained the stone. The villagers refused to touch it. Even the scholars, who had come armed with ink and instruments, found themselves hesitant. One whispered that the chalice was no offering but a seal, the last knot of a prayer too vast to be spoken aloud. The chamber was sealed again by nightfall, the door bricked over once more, though not before someone noticed the salt had risen slightly in the chalice, as if remembering each breath that had been given to keep it full. Those who visit the ruins of St. Aurelia today do not speak of it lightly. The convent itself is little more than a husk, its walls leaning inward, its roof collapsed in places where ivy has torn through beams. Time has worn the cloisters to dust and the chapel floor to rubble. But the eastern wing, the place where the prayer room once stood, remains curiously intact. Even in storms that toppled bell towers and split oak trees, the wall has held. Travelers say the air near it feels heavier, as though sound itself is muffled before it can reach the stone. At night, when the wind settles and the insects quiet, a faint vibration can be felt beneath the silence, a hum too low to carry but too steady to ignore. Some claim it is only imagination, the mind bending to legend, but others insist the sound is real. Campers who dared to spend the night nearby reported waking to a harmony of voices, soft and measured, weaving through the darkness in perfect unison. The tones carried no words, only the suggestion of prayer, a rhythm that lingered in the ears long after the sun rose. One visitor recorded the sound on a handheld device, yet when played back, there was nothing but static. He swore the humming had shaken the glass of his lantern, rattling in time with each beat. Historians who walk the grounds with notebooks and cameras describe a strange disorientation, as if time bends briefly within the walls. Watches stop, compass needles spin. Some researchers insist that when they stand at the threshold of the sealed room, their own pulse slows, aligning with a rhythm that does not belong to them. They leave pale and sweating, their mouths dry, murmuring that they felt listened to rather than the other way around. Among the locals, the story has shifted into warning. They do not say the sisters prayed to God, nor even that they were saints. Instead, they whisper that the sisters are still there, bound not by flesh but by sound, weaving silence into chains that hold something shut. The prayer was never meant for heaven. It was meant for the earth itself, for whatever waited inside those stones. On certain nights, travelers pause at the edge of the ruined yard and swear they hear it too, the faint hum of 14 voices braided together, soft as breath. Some walk closer, pressing their ears to the wall, desperate to believe. But the elders of the valley give a different caution. Do not listen too long, for silence has its own appetite, and what the sisters are keeping inside is not meant to be remembered, only contained.